Daniel had always loved the quiet of the night. There was something peaceful about sitting under the stars, far from the noise of the town. The forest near his home had always been his secret spot. He would often walk there alone, carrying only a small backpack, a flashlight, and his notebook. He liked to watch the sky, write down his thoughts, and sometimes imagine what lay beyond the stars. This particular evening was colder than usual. The wind whispered through the tall pine trees, making them sway gently. Daniel wrapped his jacket tighter around himself and walked carefully along the narrow path. The moon was bright and the stars twinkled like tiny lanterns in the dark sky. As he stepped over a fallen branch, he noticed something unusual. A soft, shimmering light moved between the trees, unlike any natural glow he had ever seen. At first, he thought it was a reflection from the moon on a wet leaf, but the movement was too smooth, too deliberate. He stopped in his tracks, his heart beating faster. Curiosity pushed him forward, even though a small voice in his mind warned him to stay back. "Hello?" he whispered, his voice barely louder than the rustling of the leaves. The light stopped moving. Daniel held his breath. Then, slowly, a figure stepped into the moonlight. It was a girl, but unlike any human girl he had seen. Her skin had a faint shimmer, almost like tiny stars scattered across her arms and face. Her eyes were large and glowing, reflecting the moonlight in a way that made them look otherworldly. She looked very young, perhaps his age, but there was something about her presence that felt extraordinary. The girl froze, her glowing eyes fixed on Daniel. She did not speak. Daniel noticed that she seemed frightened. Her hands were pressed close to her chest, and she took small, careful steps backward, as if she wanted to vanish into the forest. Daniel knew he had to be careful. He had no idea who or what she was, but something inside him told him to help. Slowly, he reached into his backpack and pulled out the blanket he always carried for nights like this. It was a small, warm blanket, nothing special, but it had been with him on many trips. "Hey, it's okay," he said softly, kneeling down a little so he wouldn't seem threatening. He held the blanket out toward her, letting it touch the ground first. The girl's glowing eyes widened even more. She looked at the blanket, then back at him, and then quickly glanced around, almost as if she was checking for danger. Daniel didn't move. He stayed still, showing her that he meant no harm. He remembered something his grandmother had once told him. Sometimes kindness speaks louder than words. He hoped it was true now. For a few moments, there was only silence. The wind moved through the trees and the girl's light shimmered faintly as she hesitated. Daniel felt a mix of fear and hope. He did not know what she would do. He could only wait. Then, slowly, the girl took a small step toward the blanket. Her movements were careful, almost cautious, like a deer stepping into a clearing. Daniel stayed still, holding his breath. She bent down, her glowing fingers brushing the edge of the blanket. For a moment, it seemed as though she might pull back. But she did not. She picked it up. Daniel felt relief, but it was mixed with surprise. He had offered the blanket, expecting her to wrap herself in it. Instead, she looked at him, her glowing eyes studying his face, and then she did something he could not have imagined. The girl held the blanket and slowly reached out toward him. Daniel froze, unsure of what she was doing. Then gently, she draped the blanket over his shoulders. He could feel the warmth, soft and comforting, but it was not just physical warmth. There was a strange sense of connection in that moment, something that went beyond words or even understanding. Daniel looked at her in astonishment. You're giving me the blanket?" he whispered. The girl did not answer. She only nodded slightly, her eyes shining softly. Daniel realized that this was her way of saying thank you. It was not like human thanks, but it was clear to him that she trusted him, in a way that no one else had ever trusted him before. He smiled, feeling a strange happiness in the quiet forest. "It's okay," he said gently. "I'm glad you're safe." The girl stepped closer, still silent. She seemed curious about him now, as if she wanted to understand more about this human who had offered kindness without expecting anything in return. Daniel felt a shiver run down his spine, not from fear, but from wonder. He was staring at something extraordinary, something he had only dreamed about in his wildest imaginations. The forest seemed quieter now. The wind had slowed, and even the distant sound of a river had faded. It was just Daniel and the girl sitting under the moonlight, connected by a small blanket and a moment of trust. He wondered how she had come here, where she was from, and what she needed. But for now, none of that mattered. What mattered was that she was there, alive, and he had helped her. As he watched her, he realized that some connections do not need words. Some gestures are enough to build trust, even between beings from completely different worlds. He felt a warmth in his heart that he could not explain. It was not just the blanket. It was the feeling of understanding, of sharing something silent but powerful. For the first time in his life, Daniel truly believed that kindness could reach across any distance, any difference, and any fear. The night was cold, the forest was dark, but in that small clearing under the stars there was light. Not just from the moon, but from the trust and connection between a human and a girl who was unlike anyone he had ever met. He leaned back on his hands, feeling the soft fabric of the blanket around his shoulders, and watched her carefully. She was watching him too, her glowing eyes bright and full of curiosity. Neither of them spoke, but in that silence, Daniel felt something amazing, the beginning of an extraordinary friendship, one that might change everything he thought he knew about the world. The night stretched on, full of quiet wonder and silent questions. Daniel did not know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing for certain. He would never forget this night, this girl, and the moment when a simple blanket became the bridge between two very different lives. And somewhere in the forest, the girl looked up at him, and for the first time, Daniel felt that maybe, just maybe, he was not alone in the universe. Part 2. The Gesture of Kindness. The night grew colder and the soft wind whispered through the tall trees. Daniel could feel the chill creeping through his jacket, but the blanket draped over his shoulders kept him warm. He glanced at the girl sitting a few feet away, her glowing eyes reflecting the silver moonlight. She remained silent, but there was a calmness in her presence that reassured him. Daniel didn't move closer. He knew that any sudden gesture might frighten her. Instead, he sat quietly on a fallen log, watching her carefully. The forest around them seemed alive with soft sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the gentle murmur of the river nearby. Everything was still, but the night felt alive, full of quiet magic. After a few moments, Daniel reached slowly into his backpack and pulled out a small water bottle and a snack he had packed. He set them on the ground in front of him, just in case she was hungry. The girl tilted her head slightly, observing him with those luminous eyes. She didn't move toward the food, but she did not run either. It was as if she was studying him, trying to understand his intentions. Daniel whispered softly, "It's okay. You don't have to be afraid." He wished he could explain more, but he knew she couldn't understand his words, so he sat patiently, waiting and hoping she would trust him. Minutes passed. The girl slowly rose to her feet, moving with a careful grace that seemed almost like a dance. She stepped closer to him, then stopped, lowering herself to sit cross-legged on the ground. Daniel held his breath. She was so delicate, so small, yet there was a quiet strength in the way she carried herself. Finally, she reached out her hands toward the blanket he was wearing. Daniel froze for a moment, unsure what she wanted to do. Then she gently touched the edge of the blanket, feeling its texture. Her fingers were soft, but they glowed faintly like tiny threads of light. Daniel felt a strange warmth at the touch, not just from the blanket, but from the simple act of connection. The girl looked at him, and for the first time, Daniel thought he saw a hint of a smile on her lips. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it lit up her glowing eyes. She slowly pulled the blanket toward her, but instead of wrapping herself in it, she did something unexpected. She held it out and motioned for Daniel to put it back around his shoulders. Daniel was shocked. "You want me to keep it?" he asked softly. She only nodded slightly, her eyes full of something he could not name. It was trust, and maybe something more. A silent understanding that they were no longer strangers. That this small gesture of kindness meant more than words could say. He adjusted the blanket over his shoulders again, feeling the warmth and comfort it provided. The girl sat quietly, watching him, and Daniel realized something important. Sometimes kindness is not just about giving. Sometimes it is about sharing, about creating a moment of understanding between two beings, even if they cannot speak the same language. Daniel wanted to know more about her, but he knew he could not rush it. Instead, he decided to communicate through simple gestures. He pointed to himself and whispered his name, Daniel. Then he nodded toward her, hoping she might do the same. The girl looked at him carefully, then touched her chest and pointed to herself. It was a simple gesture, but it was enough for Daniel to understand that she recognized him, that she was beginning to trust him. The night grew quieter, and Daniel felt a sense of peace he had never experienced before. He realized that this encounter was not just about curiosity or fear. It was about connection, about understanding that even across differences, two beings could find a way to communicate and care for each other. The girl slowly reached out again, this time toward the ground beside her. She picked up a small stone and held it out to Daniel. It was smooth, almost like it had been polished by water for years. Daniel took it carefully, feeling the weight and the texture. He understood that this was her way of giving something in return, a silent gesture of gratitude. He smiled and nodded, placing the stone in his pocket. "Thank you," he whispered, though he knew she might not understand the words. The girl only tilted her head and looked at him, her glowing eyes reflecting a mixture of curiosity and something Daniel could only describe as wonder. Time passed slowly. Daniel and the girl sat in silence, sharing the quiet night together. The blanket was still around his shoulders, a symbol of their unspoken bond. He could feel her presence as if it was a gentle warmth beside him. He did not need words to know that she felt safe, at least for now. At one point, Daniel carefully reached into his backpack again and pulled out his notebook and a pencil. He opened it and drew a simple picture of the moon, the trees, and two small figures sitting together. He showed it to her and she leaned closer, studying the lines. Then with her glowing fingers, she traced over the drawing, adding her own small details. Tiny stars, a small glowing shape in the corner. Daniel's heart swelled. This was communication without words, a bridge between their worlds. He realized that sometimes actions speak louder than words and trust can be built in silence. The girl's gestures were her way of saying thank you, of showing that she recognized his kindness and wanted to connect in return. The night continued to stretch on, and Daniel felt a growing sense of responsibility. He did not know where she had come from or what she needed, but he knew he could not let her feel alone. He thought about taking her home, but he was not sure how she would react. Instead, he decided to stay patient, offering her warmth, food, and the blanket, letting her set the pace. The girl seemed to understand this. She shifted slightly closer to him, as if acknowledging that he would not harm her. Daniel felt a quiet joy in that simple moment. He had come to the forest to watch the stars, but he had found something far more extraordinary, a silent friendship, a connection that transcended fear, language, and difference. As the night wore on, Daniel realized that he was learning something important. The world was bigger than he had imagined, full of surprises and beings he could not explain. But kindness, patience, and understanding were universal. They could reach across barriers, connect hearts, and create moments of trust even in the most unexpected places. He looked at the girl again, her glowing eyes fixed on him, and felt a quiet determination. He would protect her, help her, and learn from her as much as she might learn from him. The forest was still, the moonlight soft, and in that small clearing, two very different lives had found a way to meet. And Daniel knew that this night was only the beginning. The forest was silent except for the gentle rustle of leaves and the soft murmur of the distant river. Daniel could feel the cool night air brushing against his face, but the blanket around his shoulders kept him warm. He glanced at the girl sitting quietly a few feet away. She had not spoken a single word, yet her presence felt comforting, almost like a calm light in the darkness. Daniel watched her carefully. She seemed to be observing everything, the way the trees swayed, the glimmer of the stars above, even the small movements he made. Her glowing eyes held a mix of curiosity, caution, and something he could not fully understand. Every time she looked at him, he felt a strange connection, as if she could see his thoughts without a single word being spoken. He remembered the stone she had given him earlier. He kept it in his pocket, feeling its smoothness whenever he reached for it. It was a small gift, but it meant more than words could express. Daniel realized that this girl, though from a world he could not imagine, had a gentle and thoughtful nature. She was intelligent, cautious, and yet capable of trust. After a while, Daniel noticed her shifting slightly closer. She moved slowly, with careful steps that made no sound. Her glowing fingers touched the edge of the blanket he was wearing. Daniel froze for a moment, unsure what she intended to do. Then something remarkable happened. Instead of simply taking the blanket for herself, She gently reached out and draped it around Daniel's shoulders again, this time adjusting it carefully so it covered him completely. Daniel was stunned. He had offered the blanket to her, expecting her to wrap herself in its warmth. But she had given it back to him, a gesture so unexpected that he could only stare in awe. He whispered softly, You're giving it back to me?" The girl nodded slightly, her glowing eyes shining brightly. It was not just a nod of acknowledgement, it was a sign of trust, gratitude, and a silent understanding. Daniel felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the blanket. It was the feeling of being seen, appreciated, and connected in a way he had never experienced before. Daniel slowly reached out his hands, resting them gently on his knees. He did not want to make any sudden movements that might frighten her. Instead, he smiled, a small but genuine smile that he hoped she could understand. The girl watched him closely, her glowing eyes full of curiosity. Then, with a careful motion, she touched the blanket near his shoulder, pressing it gently against him. It was a silent gesture, but Daniel understood immediately. She was returning his kindness, showing that she appreciated his care. He felt a lump in his throat as he realized how rare and special this moment was. Here in the middle of a quiet forest, a human and a being from another world were communicating without words, sharing trust and warmth in a way that transcended language. The girl then moved slightly to sit beside him. Daniel noticed that she was trying to mirror his posture, crossing her legs carefully and leaning slightly forward. It was as if she wanted to share the moment more fully, to be closer without breaking the fragile trust they had built. Daniel felt a surge of protectiveness and gratitude. He had never met anyone like her, and yet he felt an undeniable bond forming. He reached into his backpack again and pulled out his notebook. He drew a small picture of the two of them sitting together under the moonlight. When he showed it to her, she leaned closer, her glowing fingers tracing over the lines he had drawn. Then she added small details, a tiny shining star, a faint outline of her glowing form beside him. Daniel watched in amazement. This was communication in its purest form. She could not speak his language and he could not speak hers. But through simple gestures and shared moments, they were beginning to understand each other. It was a lesson in patience, empathy, and the power of quiet kindness. Time seemed to stretch. The night grew colder, but neither of them moved. They sat together, sharing the warmth of the blanket and the quiet of the forest. Daniel could feel her watching him, and he watched her in return. There was a gentle rhythm to her movements, a grace that made every gesture meaningful. He realized that she was not just observing him, she was learning from him just as he was learning from her. At one point, she reached out and touched his hand lightly. Daniel did not pull away. Instead, he rested his hand against hers, feeling the faint glow of her skin. It was not a touch of warmth in the ordinary sense, but it carried a feeling of connection, trust, and silent communication. He understood that she was expressing gratitude, respect, and a desire to connect in a way he had never known before. Daniel spoke softly. "You don't have to be afraid. I won't hurt you." The girl's glowing eyes seemed to brighten at his words, though she did not respond verbally. She simply leaned slightly closer, as if acknowledging that she understood. Daniel felt a profound sense of relief. He had been nervous, unsure if his actions would frighten her. But now he realized that kindness could truly reach across worlds, even when words were impossible. Minutes passed. Daniel and the girl remained in silence, sharing a quiet companionship that felt deeper than anything he had ever experienced. He thought about the stars above, the soft rustle of the trees, and the distant river. Everything seemed to exist just for this moment, for this connection. He understood that sometimes the most powerful bonds are formed not through speech but through trust, patience, and shared experience. Finally, the girl stood slowly. She held out her hand, and Daniel realized that she wanted him to follow her. He nodded and rose carefully, keeping the blanket around his shoulders. She led him a few steps deeper into the forest, where the moonlight created a small clearing. Here the air felt warmer, calmer, as if the forest itself recognized the bond they shared. The girl stopped and looked at him. Her glowing eyes were bright and full of emotion, and Daniel felt a strange mix of awe and happiness. Then she did something he could not have anticipated. She reached out and touched the blanket gently, adjusting it slightly. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. She was showing him respect, gratitude, and care, all in one silent movement. Daniel felt his heart swell. He realized that this was not just a meeting between a human and an unknown being. It was a moment of connection, a bridge between two very different lives. He had offered her a simple blanket, and she had responded in a way that went far beyond words. In that quiet forest under the moonlight, two very different beings had learned to trust, care, and understand each other without saying a single word. The night stretched on, full of quiet wonder. Daniel knew that this was a moment he would never forget, a memory that would stay with him for the rest of his life. And as he watched the girl glowing softly in the moonlight, he understood something important. True kindness and trust can reach across any barrier, connect any hearts, and create a bond stronger than fear or doubt. And in that moment, Daniel felt a quiet certainty. This encounter was only the beginning, a first step toward a friendship that could change both their lives forever. The first light of dawn had not yet reached the forest, but the darkness no longer felt heavy. Instead, it was soft and quiet, filled with the gentle rustle of leaves and the occasional bird beginning its morning song. Daniel could feel the warmth of the blanket still draped over his shoulders. The girl sat nearby, her glowing eyes reflecting the faint light that seeped through the trees. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Words were not necessary. Daniel realized that the silence itself was a kind of conversation, a way for them to understand one another without language. He watched her carefully, noticing the small details, the way her hands moved, the gentle sway of her body, the way her eyes followed his movements. Every gesture seemed meaningful, as if she was trying to communicate, slowly but surely. Daniel reached into his backpack and pulled out his notebook again. He opened it to a blank page and drew a simple heart, then a circle around it to symbolize the two of them together. He showed it to her and she leaned closer, her glowing fingers tracing over the lines. She added her own markings, small dots, tiny swirls, and faint glowing streaks that seemed to shimmer even in the dim light. Daniel smiled. He could not understand the meaning of all her marks, but he understood the intention. She was responding, sharing a piece of herself in return. He realized that communication was more than words. It was patience, attention, and a willingness to understand one another. The girl then moved closer, sitting just beside him. She leaned slightly against him, and Daniel felt the soft warmth of her presence. It was subtle, not overwhelming, but it carried a deep sense of trust. He understood that she was comfortable now, that she believed he would not harm her. A quiet joy filled his heart. Daniel wanted to offer her more comfort, so he carefully adjusted the blanket, spreading it out so they could both sit on it. She seemed to understand the gesture immediately. She shifted slightly, allowing the blanket to touch her softly. It was a small moment, but it spoke volumes. In the quiet of the forest, under the faint light of the approaching dawn, they were sharing something extraordinary, a silent understanding that went beyond fear or uncertainty. He reached into his backpack once more and pulled out a small snack. He placed it gently on the blanket, then pointed to it and motioned for her to take some. She tilted her head, studying it, then slowly reached out and picked up a piece. She tasted it cautiously, then looked at Daniel with a subtle glow in her eyes that seemed almost like a smile. Daniel laughed softly, feeling a mixture of relief and happiness. She was learning to trust him, and he was learning to care for her. Time passed quietly. The forest around them began to brighten as the sun slowly rose, casting soft golden light through the trees. The girl shifted again, this time stretching her arms slightly, then leaning closer to Daniel. He could feel her gentle curiosity, her desire to understand him and the world he came from. It was a silent exploration, a connection that did not need words. Daniel reached out his hand carefully. She did not pull away. Instead, she placed her glowing fingers lightly on his palm. The sensation was not like anything he had felt before. It was gentle, warm, and comforting, carrying a quiet message of trust and appreciation. Daniel realized that she was teaching him something important, that connection and kindness could cross any barrier, even one as vast as their differences in origin. He smiled at her, and she seemed to respond, tilting her head in a way that felt like acknowledgement. Daniel felt a deep sense of wonder. He had never imagined that a simple act of kindness, a blanket, a patient gesture, could create such a bond. But here it was, tangible and real in the quiet forest with the first light of day. The girl then picked up a small branch and began to draw shapes in the dirt. Daniel watched carefully, then joined her, using his finger to draw beside hers. They created a small pattern together, simple but beautiful. It was not just a drawing. It was a shared moment, a creation that represented their silent communication. Each line, each mark was a conversation, a way of learning about each other without speaking. Daniel realized that she was beginning to understand human gestures. She would mimic his movements, sometimes leaning forward when he leaned, tilting her head when he tilted his. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it created a rhythm between them. He felt as if they were dancing together in silence, moving in harmony, learning from each other with patience and trust. At one point, Daniel looked around the clearing and noticed the beauty of the morning light. He pointed to a distant tree where the sunlight touched the leaves, creating a soft golden shimmer. The girl's eyes followed his gesture. She reached out with her fingers and made a small glowing mark in the air, pointing toward the light. Daniel understood immediately. She was sharing what she saw, translating her perception into a gesture he could recognize. It was another step in their silent conversation, another proof of the bond they were forming. Daniel felt a quiet awe. The world felt larger now, filled with possibilities he had never imagined. He realized that this encounter was teaching him more than he had ever expected. It was teaching patience, empathy, and the importance of understanding others, even when they seemed completely different. He had offered a simple blanket, and in return he had received a lesson that went far beyond anything material. The girl then leaned back slightly, stretching gently, and Daniel noticed her glowing eyes softening. It was a subtle expression, but he understood it as a sign of comfort and trust. She was no longer afraid. She was accepting the moment, accepting him, and perhaps even accepting herself in this new place. Daniel reached out once more, brushing a small leaf off the blanket. She watched him closely, her eyes full of curiosity and something deeper, gratitude. He realized that their bond was not just about survival or kindness. It was about connection, about finding understanding in a world that often seemed divided. The morning sun grew brighter, casting soft rays through the trees. The girl stood slowly, looking at Daniel with her glowing eyes. She did not speak, but her posture, her gestures, and the gentle glow she carried all spoke clearly. She was ready to move forward, to continue exploring this world, and she wanted him to be part of it. Daniel felt a mixture of awe and happiness. He understood that their journey together was just beginning. The forest was no longer just a quiet place for stargazing. It had become a space of trust, connection, and silent understanding. And as he looked at the girl, he felt a profound sense of wonder, knowing that a single act of kindness had led to a bond that could last a lifetime. In that moment, Daniel realized the true power of patience, empathy, and gentle care. The blanket had been only the beginning. The real gift was the connection, the silent understanding, and the trust that had grown between them. And as the sunlight filtered through the trees, he knew that this was a story he would carry with him forever. A story of two very different beings learning to understand each other, without words, in the quiet of the forest. The morning sun was rising higher now, casting golden light through the trees. The forest seemed alive with soft sounds, the gentle rustle of leaves, the distant song of birds, and the quiet murmur of the river. Daniel could feel the warmth of the blanket still around his shoulders, but the forest was no longer cold. The girl stood a few feet away, her glowing eyes reflecting the sunlight, and Daniel knew the time was coming. For hours, they had sat together, shared gestures drawn in the dirt, and communicated without words. The bond between them had grown stronger with every silent moment. Daniel had learned to understand her subtle signals, and she had begun to mirror his actions, creating a rhythm of trust and connection that neither could fully explain. Now she stood still, her gaze fixed on him. Daniel noticed a faint glow around her hands, a delicate shimmer that seemed to pulse with her presence. He understood that she was about to leave. There was no fear in her movements, only a calm acceptance, as if she had made a choice and wanted him to know. Daniel swallowed hard. He had grown attached to her in a short time, more than he had expected. "Will you come back?" he whispered, though he knew she could not answer in words. She tilted her head slightly, her glowing eyes soft and full of emotion. It was not a yes or no, just a silent acknowledgement that she had understood his question. The girl moved closer to him, then reached out and touched the blanket around his shoulders. She pressed it gently as if to say thank you, and then touched his hand softly. The warmth of her touch was unlike anything Daniel had ever felt. It was comforting, reassuring, and filled with a sense of trust. He felt tears prick his eyes, though he did not move. There was nothing to say, nothing needed. The moment itself carried all the words. Then she did something unexpected. She placed a small glowing object in his hand. It was like a tiny crystal softly pulsing with light. Daniel stared at it, amazed. He understood that this was her gift, a token of gratitude, trust, and perhaps a memory of their time together. He held it carefully, feeling its warmth and the subtle energy it carried. The girl took a few steps back, her glowing eyes fixed on him one last time. Then, in a movement as quiet as the night itself, she disappeared into the forest. Daniel stood frozen for a moment, his heart pounding. She had vanished without a sound, leaving only the blanket, the glowing crystal, and the memory of her presence. He sank to his knees, holding the crystal in his hand. The forest felt different now, full of wonder, mystery, and a quiet magic. He realized that this encounter had changed him in ways he could not fully explain. A simple act of kindness had created a connection across worlds, a bond that went beyond language, species, or understanding. Daniel looked down at the blanket around his shoulders. It had been the first gesture, the beginning of everything. He felt a deep gratitude for its warmth, both physical and emotional. The blanket had bridged the gap between fear and trust, between two very different beings. He realized that even the smallest acts of care could have extraordinary consequences. He held the crystal up to the sunlight, watching it glow. It was beautiful, but more than that, it was a reminder of the connection he had shared with her. He felt a sense of responsibility, a quiet promise to remember, protect, and honor what had happened. He understood that their meeting was rare, extraordinary, and something he would carry in his heart forever. As he walked slowly through the forest, Daniel thought about the girl, about her curiosity, her caution, and the silent trust she had placed in him. He realized that she had taught him a lesson far greater than he had expected. Kindness, patience, and empathy were universal. They could reach across barriers, connect hearts, and create understanding in ways words never could. Daniel found a small clearing and sat down, placing the blanket and crystal carefully beside him. He closed his eyes for a moment, thinking about the night, the silence, and the trust they had shared. He smiled softly, feeling a mixture of sadness and joy. She was gone, but the memory of her presence, the lessons she had taught, and the bond they had formed would remain with him forever. He thought about the stars above, the moon fading in the morning sky, and the soft light filtering through the trees. It all felt different now, more alive, more connected, and filled with quiet wonder. Daniel realized that he had been part of something extraordinary, something beyond ordinary life. A simple act of offering a blanket had led to a connection that transcended fear, language, and difference. As he packed up his backpack and prepared to leave the forest, Daniel felt a sense of peace. He knew that he would never forget this encounter. The girl had shown him that trust could be built slowly, with patience and care, and that kindness could have consequences far greater than anyone could imagine. He took one last look at the forest, the trees, and the soft light of the morning. The memory of her glowing eyes, her gentle gestures, and the way she had communicated without words filled him with awe. Daniel understood that the world was bigger than he had ever known, and that connection and understanding could exist in the most unexpected places. As he walked home, Daniel kept the crystal close to his heart and the blanket over his shoulders. He felt stronger, wiser, and more aware of the power of empathy. The encounter had changed him, showing him that even a single act of kindness could create a bond that would last a lifetime, even across worlds. And somewhere in the forest, the girl watched silently, her glow fading as she disappeared further into the trees. She carried with her the memory of Daniel's kindness, just as he carried the memory of her trust and presence. Though they were from different worlds, their connection was real, profound, and unbroken in the silence between them. Daniel smiled softly, knowing that life would never be the same. He had been touched by something extraordinary, something rare and beautiful, and he understood finally that true kindness and empathy could reach farther than anyone could imagine, creating bonds that could last forever, even in silence. The forest was quiet once more, but Daniel's heart was full. He knew that he had experienced something extraordinary, something that would stay with him forever. And as he walked toward home, he glanced back one last time, feeling a quiet hope that one day their paths might cross again,